The transport shuttle rattled as it descended toward the massive space station, floating in the darkness of space, and Maya Rodriguez pressed her face against the small window to get a better look at what would be her home for the next year. The station was enormous and stretched out like a giant wheel, spinning slowly against the backdrop of distant stars, and she could see hundreds of smaller ships docked at various ports along its outer ring. This was Epsilon 7, and it was the most prestigious military training academy in the entire Galactic Coalition, and she was about to become the first human to ever walk through its doors. The shuttle bay was crowded when Maya stepped off the ramp with her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and everywhere she looked, there were aliens of different shapes and sizes moving through the wide corridors with purpose. Some walked on 2 legs like her, while others moved on 4 or 6 limbs, and a few even floated through the air using some kind of natural ability she did not understand. The ceiling stretched high above her head and was made of some kind of metal that glowed with a soft blue light, and the air smelled strange and metallic and slightly sweet all at once. Maya stood at 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed about 130 pounds, and compared to most of the beings around her, she felt incredibly small. A group of tall reptilian creatures passed by her, and each one stood at least 7 feet tall with thick, scaled skin that looked like natural armor and powerful muscles that rippled under their green and brown hides. Their eyes followed her as they walked past, and she heard them talking in a language that sounded like rocks, grinding together until her translator implant kicked in and converted their words into English. "Is that the human?" one of them said with a voice that dripped with contempt. "Must be," another replied with what sounded like a laugh. "Look how tiny it is. Earth must be desperate to send something so weak to a combat academy," the first one said, and they all made a rumbling sound that her implant translated as laughter. Maya kept her expression neutral and continued walking toward the registration desk, even though she felt dozens of eyes watching her from every direction. She had expected this reaction because Earth had only joined the Galactic Coalition 3 months ago, and humans were still considered newcomers and outsiders by most species. The Coalition had been around for thousands of years and included 47 different, intelligent species from across the galaxy, and humanity was the newest and least proven member of that group. The registration desk was staffed by a massive creature with deep purple scales and 4 arms and eyes that glowed amber in the station's artificial light. He wore a military uniform with insignia that marked him as a commander, and when Maya approached the desk, he looked down at her with obvious disapproval written across his alien features. "Name," he said in a deep voice that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez," she replied, and stood at attention. "Reporting for training assignment." The commander, whose nameplate identified him as Vex, tapped at a holographic display with 2 of his 4 hands and scrolled through information that Maya could not read from her angle. He made a sound that her translator could not quite convert, and then fixed her with a hard stare that would have made most people take a step back. "Human," he said, and it was not a question. "Earth sends us 1 trainee, and this is what they choose." Maya did not respond because she knew the commander was not looking for an answer, and she had learned long ago that some situations required silence more than words. Vex continued tapping at his display for another minute, and then a small metallic card emerged from a slot in the desk. "You are assigned to Barracks Wing 7, Vex said, and slid the card across the desk toward her. "This is a combat-focused training group, and the physical requirements are extreme. Most species wash out within the first month." "I understand, sir," Maya said, and picked up the card. "I doubt that you do," Vex replied. "Barracks Wing 7 houses Krell warriors and Thorian combat specialists and Zentari tactical officers. These are proven species with centuries of military tradition. Humans have no such history with us." Maya wanted to point out that humans had plenty of military history, but she knew that was not what Vex meant, and so she simply nodded and asked for directions to the barracks. Vex gestured with one of his hands toward a corridor on the left side of the registration area, and then dismissed her with a wave that clearly indicated he had no interest in speaking with her further. The walk to Barracks Wing 7 took 15 minutes through corridors that were busy with activity, and Maya passed training rooms where she could see cadets practicing with weapons and equipment she had never seen before. She passed a cafeteria that seemed to serve food for dozens of different species, and the smells that came from that room were both appetizing and disturbing at the same time. She passed a medical bay with equipment that looked more like torture, devices than healing tools, and she reminded herself that alien biology was vastly different from human biology. The entrance to Barracks Wing 7 was marked with symbols that her translator identified as warning signs about the combat nature of the training conducted in this section. Maya pressed her card against a reader next to the door and it slid open with a smooth hiss, and she stepped into a large common area filled with bunks and lockers and training equipment. The room fell silent the moment she entered, and every head turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of their stares like a physical pressure against her skin. There were at least 30 cadets in the common area, and most of them were the same reptilian species she had seen earlier. A few were the purple-scaled Thorians like Commander Vex, and several were a species she had not seen before with sleek bodies and silvery skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. All of them were larger than her, and all of them were watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Maya spotted her bunk assignment in the far corner of the room and began walking toward it with steady steps and her duffel bag still slung over her shoulder. The crowd did not part for her, but she moved around them without making eye contact and without showing any sign of the nervousness that was building in her chest. She had been in hostile environments before during her military training on Earth, but this was different because here she was not just representing herself, but her entire species. Maya reached her assigned bunk and set her duffel bag down on the thin mattress and began to unpack her belongings with deliberate movements that she hoped looked calm and confident. She could still feel eyes on her from every direction, and the whispered conversations that filled the room were probably about her, even though she could not make out individual words over the general noise. Her bunk was in the corner, which gave her a wall at her back and a clear view of the rest of the common area, and she appreciated that small advantage, even as she recognized how vulnerable her position was. She pulled out her spare uniforms and folded them neatly into the locker beside her bunk, and then arranged her personal items in the small storage compartment built into the wall. She had not brought much from Earth because the transport weight limits were strict, and also because she had learned during her military career that traveling light was always better than being weighed down by unnecessary possessions. A photo of her family went on the small shelf above her bunk, and a worn paperback book that had belonged to her grandfather went beside it, and then she pulled out her toiletry kit and began organizing those items as well. She had been unpacking for maybe 5 minutes when she heard heavy footsteps approaching from behind, and she did not turn around immediately because she wanted to finish placing her toothbrush and soap in their designated spots before dealing with whatever was coming. The footsteps stopped right behind her, and she could hear breathing that sounded like wind moving through a cave, and then a deep voice spoke in that grinding rocks language that her implant translated a moment later. "You are in my section, human," the voice said. Maya turned slowly and found herself looking up at 3 of the tall reptilian creatures that she now knew were called Krell. The one in the center was slightly larger than the other 2 and had darker scales with patterns of red and orange running down his neck and arms. His eyes were yellow with vertical slits for pupils, and when he opened his mouth to speak again, she could see rows of sharp teeth designed for tearing meat. The 2 Krell flanking him were nearly identical, with green-brown scales and powerful builds that made them look like they could break her in half without much effort. "I am Drak the Center," Krell said, and gestured at himself with one clawed hand. "This is my barracks, and these bunks are for warriors only." Maya glanced at the other 2 Krell and noted their positions and the way they had spread out slightly to block any easy path of escape from her corner location. The one on the left had a scar running down his face, and the one on the right had one arm that seemed slightly larger than the other, and she filed away these observations without consciously thinking about why they might be important. "My assignment card says this is my bunk," Maya said, and kept her voice level and calm. "If there is a problem with that, then you should take it up with Commander Vex." Drak made that rumbling sound that translated as laughter, and his 2 companions joined in, and the sound drew even more attention from the other cadets in the room. Maya could see aliens gathering around them in a loose circle, and she recognized the universal body language of people anticipating a confrontation. No one moved to intervene, and no one called for security, and she understood that this was some kind of test that she would have to face on her own. "Commander Vex made a mistake," Drak said, and took a step closer to her. Humans do not belong in combat training and you will wash out within days. It is better if you leave now before you embarrass yourself and your weak species, Maya considered her options carefully because she knew that how she handled this moment would determine how the rest of her time at the academy would go. She could back down and ask for a transfer to different barracks, but that would confirm every negative opinion these aliens had about humans. She could report Drock to the authorities, but that would make her look like someone who could not handle her own problems. Or she could stand her ground and deal with whatever consequences came from that choice. I am not going anywhere, Maya said. Drock's eyes narrowed and his lips pulled back to show more of those sharp teeth, and he reached out with one large hand toward her shoulder. His reach was long, and his hand was easily twice the size of hers, and his claws looked sharp enough to cut through her uniform without much resistance. Maya watched his hand coming toward her, and her mind went through a series of rapid calculations about weight and balance and leverage and points of vulnerability that she had learned during years of training in various martial arts. The moment Drock's hand closed around her shoulder, she felt the pressure of his grip and knew that he was not trying to hurt her yet, but rather testing her reaction and establishing dominance through physical contact. In Krell culture, this was probably a normal way to settle disputes and show superiority, but Maya had grown up in a culture where grabbing someone without permission was an act of aggression that justified a response. Drock pulled her forward slightly, and she let him move her because resistance at this point would be wasted energy against his superior strength. Instead, she studied the angle of his pull and the way his weight shifted onto his back leg to support the action, and the way his other hand hung loose at his side, ready to grab her if she tried to twist away. She noticed that his stance was wide, which gave him stability, but also meant his center of gravity was high and his balance was committed in one direction. You see, Drock said to the watching crowd, humans are weak and… Maya moved before he could finish his sentence, and everything she did happened in less than 2 seconds. But to her it felt like slow motion because her training had taught her to find calm in the middle of chaos. She pivoted low and to the left, which broke Drock's grip on her shoulder, and put her inside his reach where his size became a disadvantage. She grabbed his arm with both hands and used his own pulling momentum against him, and dropped her hips below his center of gravity. Then she executed a textbook hip throw that sent all 7 feet and 300 pounds of Krell warrior flying through the air. Drock hit the floor with a crash that shook the entire barracks, and his armored scales made a sound like breaking pottery, even though they protected him from serious injury. The room went completely silent except for the ringing echo of his impact, and Maya stepped back from him with her hands up in a neutral guard position because she knew this was not over yet. For a moment, Drock just lay there on his back with a stunned expression on his alien face, and Maya could see him trying to process what had just happened. Then his expression changed to rage, and he rolled over and pushed himself up with a roar that needed no translation. He charged at her like an angry bull, and his 2 companions moved in from the sides to help him. And Maya realized that this had just escalated from a test to a real fight. Maya had perhaps 3 seconds to assess the situation before the 3 Krell reached her, and in those 3 seconds her mind went through everything she knew about fighting multiple opponents. The key was to never let them surround her and to use their numbers against them by keeping them in each other's way, and to strike fast and move faster so they could never pin her down. She had trained for scenarios like this dozens of times in the gym back on Earth, but those training partners had been human and roughly her size, and these Krell were massive alien warriors with natural weapons and armor that could shrug off strikes that would drop a person. Drock came at her first with his arms spread wide, trying to tackle her, and Maya waited until the last possible second before sidestepping to her right. His momentum carried him past her and straight into the path of the scarred Krell who was coming from that direction, and the 2 of them collided with enough force to make them both stumble. The 3rd Krell with the oversized arm swung at her head with a backhanded strike that would have knocked her unconscious if it had connected, but Maya ducked under it and felt the wind of his passing hand ruffle her hair. She came up inside his guard and drove her elbow into the side of his knee joint, which was one of the vulnerable spots that the xenobiology briefing had mentioned during her pre-deployment training. The Krell's leg buckled and he made a sound like steam escaping from a valve, and Maya was already moving before he hit the ground. She rolled forward and came up on her feet just as Drock and the scarred Krell separated and turned back toward her with renewed fury in their yellow eyes. The circle of watching cadets had grown larger, and Maya could hear them making Sounds of surprise and excitement in a dozen different languages. She caught a glimpse of the silvery-skinned aliens watching with interest, and several Thorians who had stopped what they were doing to see what the commotion was about. No one moved to help her and no one called for security, and she understood that this was being allowed to play out because everyone wanted to see what the human could do. Drak came at her, again, but this time he was more cautious and kept his balance centered, and his movements controlled. The scarred Krell moved to flank her on the left, and Maya knew she had maybe 10 seconds before the third Krell recovered from her strike to his knee. She needed to end this quickly, or she would be overwhelmed by their combined size and strength. Maya feinted toward Drak and then spun low toward the scarred Krell, who was not expecting her to come at him instead of away. She swept his legs with a technique that targeted the ankle joint, and he went down hard on his back with his head bouncing off the floor. Before he could recover, Maya was back on her feet and moving toward Drak, who had turned to follow her movement. He grabbed at her with both hands and this time managed to catch her uniform sleeve, and his grip was like iron, and she knew she could not break it with strength alone. Instead, she rotated into his grip rather than away from it and stepped close enough that she could smell his breath, which was hot and smelled like sulfur. She drove her knee into the soft spot under his ribs where the briefing had indicated most species kept vulnerable organs, and Drak's grip loosened just enough for her to twist free. The third Krell was back on his feet, now and limping, but still dangerous, and all three of them were circling her with more respect in their movements, but also more determination to prove that humans were not a threat. Maya's breathing was coming faster now, and she could feel sweat running down her back, and her muscles were starting to burn from the constant movement and explosive bursts of energy. She knew she could not keep this up forever because despite her training, she was still human, and they were still larger and stronger and had natural advantages that no amount of skill could completely overcome. Drak made a sound that brought the other two Krell in at the same time, and Maya found herself facing a coordinated attack that was much more dangerous than their earlier attempts. The scarred one grabbed for her left side while the third one grabbed for her right, and Drak came straight at her center, with his arms spread to catch her no matter which direction she dodged. Maya dropped straight down to the floor and rolled backward between the scarred Krell's legs and came up behind him before any of them could react. She jumped onto his back and wrapped her arm around his thick neck in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain without blocking his airway. The Krell thrashed and tried to reach back to pull her off, but she had positioned herself where his arms could not reach, and she squeezed with all her strength while using her legs to control his movement. Drak and the third Krell rushed to help their companion, but Maya released the chokehold before the scarred one passed out and pushed off his back, using his momentum to launch herself at the third Krell. She hit him in the chest with both feet in a flying kick that sent him stumbling backward into Drak, and both of them went down in a tangle of limbs and tails. Maya landed on her feet and immediately moved to keep all three Krell in her line of sight because she knew that turning her back on any of them would be fatal. Her right ankle was starting to hurt from where she had twisted it during the roll, and her knuckles were bleeding from where they had scraped against Krell scales during the fight. Her breath was coming in gasps now, and she could taste blood in her mouth from where she had bitten her tongue at some point. The three Krell got back to their feet, and she could see that they were also showing signs of wear. The scarred one was rubbing his neck where she had choked him, and the third one was favoring his chest where she had kicked him, and even Drak was moving more slowly than he had at the start. They looked at each other and seemed to have some kind of silent communication, and then they all came at her at once in a final coordinated rush. Maya knew she could not dodge all three of them this time because they had learned from their mistakes and were moving in a way that cut off her escape routes. She had one chance to end this, and it required perfect timing and a willingness to take some damage in order to create an opening. She waited until they were almost on top of her, and then she dove forward under Drak's reaching arms and rolled between his legs, coming up behind him, before Drak could turn around. Maya jumped onto his back and wrapped her legs around his waist and her arms around his neck in a rear naked choke that was one of the most effective submissions in human martial arts. Drak roared and spun around, trying to throw her off, but she held on tight and squeezed with perfect technique, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. The other two Krell grabbed at her, trying to pull her off, but she had positioned herself so that pulling her would also pull on Drak's neck and increase the pressure of the choke. Drak's movements became slower and less coordinated as his brain was starved of oxygen, and Maya whispered in his ear, even though she knew he probably could not understand her words. She told him that she could put him to sleep right now in front of everyone, or he could tap out and end this with some dignity left. For a long moment, Druck continued to struggle, and then his hand came up and tapped against her arm 3 times in the universal signal of submission. Maya released the choke immediately and dropped off Druck's back and stepped away from all 3 Krell with her hands still up in a guard position, because she did not trust that the fight was truly over. Druck stumbled forward and caught himself on a nearby bunk and stood there for a moment, breathing heavily while his 2 companions moved to his sides. The entire barracks was silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant hum of the station's air circulation systems, and Maya could feel every eye in the room focused on her. She was exhausted and her body was starting to shake from the adrenaline crash that always followed intense combat, and her ankle was throbbing with pain that she had been ignoring during the fight but could no longer push aside. Blood dripped from her knuckles onto the floor, and she could feel bruises forming on her ribs where Druck had managed to land a glancing blow at some point. Despite all of this, she kept her expression neutral and her posture ready, because showing weakness now would undo everything she had just accomplished. Druck turned to face her, and his yellow eyes were unreadable, and for a terrible moment Maya thought he might attack again despite having submitted. Instead, he made a gesture with his hand that involved touching his chest and then extending his palm toward her, and his 2 companions copied the movement. Her translator implant processed the gesture and informed her that it was a sign of respect among Krell warriors and was only given to those who had proven themselves in combat. Before anyone could speak, the doors to the barracks burst open and 3 security officers rushed in with weapons drawn, and behind them came Commander Vex, looking even more intimidating than he had at the registration desk. The security officers were another species that Maya had not seen before, with blue skin and multiple eyes, and they quickly assessed the scene with professional efficiency. One of them spotted the blood on the floor and the overturned bunks and the 3 Krell standing in a defensive formation, and immediately moved to restrain them. "What happened here?" Commander Vex demanded, and his voice was loud enough to make the walls vibrate. The room erupted in multiple voices, all trying to explain at once in different languages, and the translator implants struggled to keep up with the chaos. Vex held up one of his 4 hands and everyone fell silent again, and then he pointed at one of the silvery-skinned aliens who had been watching from the beginning. "You," Vex said. "Explain what happened." The silvery alien stepped forward, and Maya's implant identified her species as Zentari, who were known for their intelligence and diplomatic skills. The Zentari spoke in a melodic voice that was surprisingly pleasant to hear, and she explained exactly what had happened from the moment Maya had entered the barracks. She did not embellish or leave anything out, and she made it clear that Druck and his companions had initiated the physical contact and that Maya had only defended herself. Other cadets nodded in agreement, and several more. Zentari stepped forward to confirm the story, and even a few Thorians admitted that the human had been provoked. Vex listened to all of this with an expression that grew darker with each testimony, and when the explanations were finished, he turned his amber eyes toward Druck and his 2 companions. "You initiated physical contact with a fellow cadet," Vex said, and it was not a question. Druck straightened his posture and met the commander's gaze without flinching, which Maya had to admit showed courage, even if it also showed stupidity. He spoke in his grinding rocks language and explained that he had been testing the human's worthiness to be in combat barracks, and that he had not expected her to fight back with such effectiveness. He claimed it was within his rights as senior cadet in the barracks to challenge newcomers, and that this was tradition. Vex made a sound that the translators could not process, and then he spoke in a language that Maya's implant identified as High Thorian, which was apparently the official language of the coalition military. Every cadet in the room suddenly stood at attention, including Druck and his companions, and Maya quickly copied their posture, even though she was not sure what was being said. "Tradition does not excuse assault," Vex said, and switched back to common language. "You 3 will report to detention level for processing, and you will face disciplinary action for initiating violence against a fellow cadet. You are confined to quarters when not in training, and you will have no recreational privileges for 1 month. The 3 Krell accepted their punishment without protest, and the security officers led them out of the barracks with professional efficiency. Vex watched them go and then turned his attention to Maya who was still standing at attention despite the pain in her ankle and the exhaustion that was making her legs shake. He studied her for a long moment and she could not read his expression, but she got the feeling that he was reassessing everything he thought he knew about humans. "You are injured," Vex said finally. "Nothing serious, sir," Maya replied. "You will report to medical bay for evaluation," Vex said. "That is an order, not a suggestion." Maya nodded and started to move toward the door, but her ankle gave out on the first step, and she would have fallen if one of the Zentari had not caught her arm. The Zentari was smaller than most species in the room, but still slightly taller than Maya, and her silvery skin was warm to the touch, and her eyes were large and dark and showed genuine concern. "I am Kira," the Zentari said. "I will help you to medical bay." "Thank you," Maya said and accepted the support, even though part of her wanted to refuse help and walk out on her own power. Vex watched this exchange and then addressed the entire barracks in a voice that carried authority and warning in equal measure. He told them that any further incidents of violence would result in immediate expulsion from the academy, and that every cadet, regardless of species, was to be treated with respect and given the opportunity to prove themselves through training rather than through brawling. He made it clear that Maya had acted within regulations by defending herself and that anyone who had a problem with her presence should take it up with him. Personally, after Vex left the barracks, the atmosphere changed and Maya could feel the difference in how the other cadets looked at her. The hostility was still there in some faces, but it was mixed with respect now and curiosity, and in some cases even fear. She had proven that humans could fight and that size was not the only factor that mattered in combat, and word of this would spread throughout the station within hours. Kira helped Maya limp toward the exit, and as they passed through the barracks, several cadets moved aside to give them space, and one of the Thorians actually nodded at Maya with what might have been approval. Maya nodded back and continued walking because she knew that showing weakness now would be a mistake. Even though every step sent pain shooting up her leg, the walk to medical bay took longer than it should have because Maya's ankle was worse than she had initially thought, and Kira had to practically carry her for the last 100 meters. The medical bay was staffed by a species that looked like walking plants with multiple flexible limbs, and they took one look at Maya and immediately brought out equipment that looked both advanced and terrifying. The medical bay was unlike anything Maya had ever seen in her years of military service on Earth, and the plant-like beings who staffed it moved with an efficiency that suggested they had treated thousands of injured cadets from dozens of different species. One of them approached her with limbs that ended in delicate tendrils and gestured toward an examination table that adjusted its shape to accommodate her human form when she sat down on it. The plant being made sounds like rustling leaves, and Maya's translator identified the species as Verdani, who were renowned medical experts across the coalition. The examination was thorough and surprisingly gentle, and the Verdani used scanning devices that hummed and glowed with soft green light as they passed over her body. Maya watched the readouts on screens that showed her skeletal structure and muscle tissue and circulatory system in ways that would have impressed the doctors back on Earth. Her ankle was sprained but not broken, and her ribs were bruised but not cracked, and the cuts on her knuckles were superficial and would heal quickly with the proper treatment. The Verdani applied a gel-like substance to her injuries that felt cool against her skin, and within seconds the pain began to fade to a dull ache. They wrapped her ankle in a flexible bandage that provided support while still allowing movement, and they gave her a small container of pills that her translator informed her would help with inflammation and promote faster healing. The entire process took less than 20 minutes, and when it was finished, the Verdani made a gesture that Maya interpreted as approval for her to leave. Kira had waited outside during the examination, and when Maya emerged walking with only a slight limp, the Zentari smiled with an expression that translated across species boundaries. They began the walk back to the barracks, and Kira explained that she had been at the academy for 6 months and had never seen anything like what Maya had just done. She admitted that most cadets avoided the Krell because they were known for being aggressive and territorial, and no one wanted to challenge them physically. "How did you learn to fight like that?" Kira asked, and her voice carried genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Maya considered how to answer because explaining human martial arts to an alien who had no frame of reference was not going to be easy. She started by saying that humans had no natural weapons or armor and were relatively weak compared to many predators. on Earth, and so they had to develop techniques that allowed them to win fights against stronger opponents. She explained that over thousands of years, humans had created hundreds of different fighting systems that focused on leverage and technique and exploiting vulnerabilities rather than relying on brute strength. Kira listened with complete attention and asked intelligent questions about specific moves and principles, and seemed fascinated by the concept that an entire species had built their combat doctrine around compensating for physical disadvantages. Maya found herself enjoying the conversation because it was the first time since arriving at the station that someone had treated her as an equal rather than as either a curiosity or a threat. They returned to the barracks to find that the news of the fight had already spread beyond their immediate area, and dozens of cadets from other wings had gathered to see the human who had defeated 3 Krell warriors. Maya tried to slip past the crowd, but they parted for her like she was royalty, and she could feel their eyes following her every movement. Some looked impressed while others looked skeptical, and a few looked like they were already planning their own challenges. Her bunk area had been cleaned up during her absence, and someone had straightened the overturned furniture and wiped up the blood from the floor. Her belongings were still where she had left them, and the photo of her family still sat on the shelf above her bunk, looking out of place among all the alien technology and architecture. Maya sat down on her bunk carefully and pulled off her boots, and her ankle protested, but the pain was manageable with the medication the Verdani had given her. Kira sat on the bunk across from her and explained the daily schedule at the academy, which started at 0600 with physical training and continued through various combat simulations and tactical exercises until 2200 when lights out was enforced. Meals were taken in the main cafeteria and were designed to meet the nutritional needs of all species, though Kira warned that some of the food options would probably taste strange to human palates. Recreational time was limited to 1 hour per day, and most cadets used it to train more or to socialize with others from their species. Over the next few hours, more cadets approached Maya to introduce themselves and ask questions about humans and Earth. Most were polite, though some were clearly testing her to see if she would react with aggression again. A group of Thorians asked about human military structure and seemed impressed when she explained the chain of command and rank systems. Several Zentari wanted to know about human culture and art and philosophy, and seemed disappointed when Maya admitted she was a soldier first and not particularly knowledgeable about those subjects. When the evening meal was called, Maya joined the flow of cadets heading to the cafeteria, with Kira serving as her guide through the massive space station. The cafeteria was enormous and could easily seat 1,000 beings at once, and the serving areas were divided by species requirements with separate sections for carnivores and herbivores and beings who consumed energy or minerals instead of organic matter. Maya found the human-compatible section, which was small and looked like it had been added recently, and selected items that looked familiar enough to be safe. The food was adequate, though not particularly flavorful, and she sat with Kira at a table near the edge of the cafeteria where they could watch the social dynamics of the different species. Kira pointed out the various groups and explained the unofficial hierarchy that existed among cadets, with Krell occupying the top tier as combat specialists and Zentari holding respect for their intelligence, and Verdani being generally left alone because no one wanted to anger the people who might need to save their lives one day. Where do humans fit in this hierarchy? Maya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. That is what everyone is trying to figure out, Kira said with a slight smile. Before today, most species thought humans would be at the bottom because you are small and have no natural weapons. Now people are not so sure. As if to prove her point, Maya noticed that other cadets were watching her from nearby tables and whispering among themselves. Some looked curious while others looked hostile, and a few looked calculating, like they were trying to figure out if allying with humans might be advantageous. Maya understood that her fight with Drak had changed something fundamental about how her species was perceived, but she also knew that one victory was not enough to establish lasting respect. After dinner, Maya and Kira returned to the barracks and found that Drak and his 2 companions had also returned from their detention processing. The 3 Krell were sitting on their bunks at the opposite end of the room, and the atmosphere was tense when Maya entered. Every cadet in the barracks stopped what they were doing and watched to see what would happen next, and Maya could feel the weight of their expectations. Drak stood up slowly and crossed the barracks toward her, and Maya prepared herself for another confrontation even though her body was not ready for another fight so soon. But when Drock reached her, he did not raise his hands or make any aggressive movements, and instead he spoke in his grinding rocks, language that her translator converted into words she could understand. "You fight with honor," Drock said. "I challenge you again when you are healed and when I have trained more." Maya looked up at the massive Krell warrior and saw something in his yellow eyes that might have been respect or might have been determination or might have been both. She nodded slowly and extended her hand in a human gesture of agreement, and after a moment of confusion, Drock reached out and gripped her hand carefully as if afraid he might break it. "I look forward to it," Maya said and meant it. The alarm that woke Maya at 0600 the next morning was a harsh sound that cut through the darkness of the barracks and brought every cadet to their feet within seconds. Her ankle was still sore, but the Verdani medicine had worked better than she expected, and she could walk without limping as she joined the flow of cadets heading to the training facilities. Physical training started with a 5-kilometer run through corridors that spiraled around the station's outer ring, and Maya found herself running beside beings who were twice her size and had twice as many legs. The Krell cadets set a brutal pace that left many species struggling to keep up, but Maya had trained for endurance since she was a teenager, and her smaller size actually became an advantage because she needed less oxygen and generated less heat. She finished the run in the top third of the group and was barely breathing hard when they arrived at the training gymnasium. Several Thorians looked at her with surprise, and one of them made a comment to his companion that her translator identified as acknowledgement that humans might be more capable than initial appearances suggested. The gymnasium was vast and filled with equipment designed for dozens of different body types, and the morning routine involved strength training and flexibility exercises and balance drills that tested every cadet's physical limits. Maya worked through the routines with focused intensity and adapted the exercises to her human physiology where necessary. She could not lift as much weight as the Krell or match the flexibility of some of the species with boneless limbs, but she made up for it with perfect form and unwavering determination. Training started after breakfast, and this was where Maya truly began to shine in ways that caught the attention of instructors and fellow cadets alike. The first session was zero-gravity combat, which took place in a spherical chamber where artificial gravity could be turned off, and combatants had to fight while floating in three-dimensional space. Most species struggled with this environment because their brains were wired for fighting on solid ground with a clear sense of up and down. Maya had trained for zero-gravity combat during her astronaut certification program back on Earth, and she understood the principles of momentum and inertia and how to use minimal movements to control her position. When she was paired against a Thorian cadet who outweighed her by 100 pounds, she used his own mass against him by redirecting his attacks and sending him spinning helplessly through the chamber. The instructor who was observing made notes on a holographic tablet, and Maya caught him looking at her with an expression that might have been approval. The afternoon brought weapons training, and Maya was issued a standard coalition pulse rifle that was designed to be used by multiple species with adjustable grips and trigger mechanisms. The weapon felt strange in her hands compared to the firearms she had trained with on Earth, but the basic principles were similar enough that she adapted quickly. On the firing range, she scored in the top 10% of her group, and several instructors stopped to watch her shoot and discuss among themselves what they were seeing. Hand-to-hand combat evaluation came later in the week, and this was what everyone had been waiting for because word of her fight with Drock had spread throughout the entire academy. The evaluation took place in a large arena with padded floors and walls, and hundreds of cadets gathered in the viewing areas to watch. Maya was paired against opponents from different species one at a time, and each match lasted until one combatant either submitted or was unable to continue. Her first opponent was a Zentari who relied on speed and agility rather than strength, and the match was like a chess game where both fighters tried to anticipate each other's moves. Maya won by using a leg sweep at the exact moment the Zentari committed to a high kick, and the Zentari went down hard, but acknowledged defeat with grace. Her second opponent was a species she had not encountered before, with 4 arms and a low center of gravity, and that match took longer because she had to figure out how to deal with multiple limbs coming at her from different angles. She defeated the 4-armed opponent by focusing on leg attacks that neutralized his stable base and then using a submission hold that controlled two of his arms while leaving the other two unable to reach her. The crowd made sounds of approval, and Maya could see cadets from various species discussing what they had witnessed. Her third opponent was another Krell, who was even larger than Druck and who had clearly studied her previous fight and developed strategies to counter her techniques. That match was the hardest yet, because the Krell kept his distance and used his superior reach to land strikes while staying out of range of her grappling attempts. Maya took several hits that left bruises on her arms and shoulders, but she waited patiently for an opening, and when it came, she exploded forward with a level change that got under his defense. She took him down with a double-leg takedown and transitioned to a position where she could control him, despite his size advantage, and after 2 minutes of struggle, he tapped out. The instructor who was overseeing the evaluations was a grizzled Thorian veteran with scars covering his purple scales and a reputation for being impossible to impress. He called Maya over after her third victory and studied her with eyes that had seen countless battles and trained thousands of cadets. He asked her where she had learned to fight, and she explained about human martial arts and military combatives, training, and the long history of her species developing techniques to overcome physical disadvantages. The instructor listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he made a sound that her translator identified as thoughtful consideration. He told her that in his 40 years of teaching combat, he had never seen anyone adapt to different opponents as quickly as she did, and that her understanding of leverage and body mechanics was at a level that most cadets never reached. He said that humans might not be the strongest or fastest species in the coalition, but they had clearly mastered the art of fighting smarter rather than harder. Over the following weeks, Maya continued to excel in every aspect of training, and her reputation grew with each passing day. Tactical simulations showed that she had an intuitive grasp of strategy and could think 3 moves ahead of her opponents. Survival exercises and hostile environment chambers demonstrated that humans were remarkably adaptable and could function in conditions that other species found challenging. Leadership scenarios revealed that she had natural command presence and could inspire loyalty even from beings who had initially dismissed her. Other cadets started seeking her out for training advice and sparring sessions. Kira became her closest friend, and they spent their limited free time discussing philosophy and culture and sharing stories about their respective homeworlds. Druck kept his promise and challenged her to rematches regularly, and each fight was more competitive than the last as he learned from his mistakes and developed counters to her techniques. The other 2 Krell who had fought her that first day also trained with her and admitted that fighting humans required a completely different mindset than fighting other species. Commander Vex watched all of this from a distance, and Maya could see that his initial disdain for humans had shifted to cautious respect, though he never acknowledged it directly. She caught him discussing human combat techniques with other instructors and reviewing footage of her training sessions and making notes about how coalition doctrine might need to adapt to account for this new species and their unusual approach to warfare. The news spread beyond the academy as well, and Maya started receiving messages from coalition military officials who wanted to know more about human capabilities. Earth's ambassador to the coalition contacted her to say that her performance was changing perceptions of humanity at the highest levels of government, and that recruitment for future academy classes was increasing as more humans wanted to follow in her footsteps. She was becoming not just a cadet, but a symbol of what her species could contribute to the larger galactic community. 6 months passed in a blur of training and studying and combat drills and tactical exercises, and Maya found herself standing in the Grand Assembly Hall, waiting for the graduation ceremony to begin. The hall was massive, with a ceiling that seemed to stretch up forever, and walls lined with banners representing every species in the coalition, and she stood in formation with 300 other cadets who had survived the brutal training program. She wore the formal uniform of a coalition officer with insignia, marking her specialization in combat operations and her rank of lieutenant, and she felt the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. The graduation ceremony was conducted with military precision, and cadets were called forward one at a time to receive their assignments and commendations. Maya watched as Kira received assignment to a diplomatic vessel, where her intelligence and language skills would be put to use in first contact situations. She watched as Drak and his two companions were assigned to a Krell battle group where they would serve as frontline warriors defending Coalition territory. She watched as dozens of other cadets from various species received their orders and began the next chapter of their careers. When her name was called, Maya walked to the stage where Commander Vex and several other high-ranking officers waited to present her with her assignment. The hall fell silent and she could feel hundreds of eyes watching her, and she knew that many beings across the galaxy were also watching via live transmission because her story had become known far beyond the Academy walls. Vex held a data pad, with her orders, and his expression was neutral, but his eyes showed something that might have been pride. "Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez," Vex said in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "Your performance over the past 6 months has been exceptional. Your combat scores are the highest in Academy history. Your tactical evaluations place you in the top percentile of all cadets who have ever trained here. Your leadership assessments indicate natural command ability that is rare in officers of any species." The audience made sounds of approval in a dozen different languages, and Maya stood at attention while Vex continued speaking. He talked about how her presence at the Academy had changed training protocols and inspired instructors to reconsider their assumptions about combat effectiveness. He mentioned that several species had requested human combat trainers for their own military programs, and that Earth had received dozens of applications from alien cadets wanting to study human martial arts. "Your assignment reflects the importance that Coalition Command places on your unique skills," Vex said and handed her the data pad. "You will lead the first mixed-species combat unit designated as Task Force Unity. Your team will consist of warriors from 5 different species chosen for their complementary abilities. Your mission will be to serve as a rapid response force for situations that require adaptability and creative problem-solving rather than overwhelming force." Maya accepted the data pad and read through her orders quickly, noting the names and species of her team members. 2 Krell warriors, including Drak, who had specifically requested to serve under her command. 1 Thorian tactical specialist. 1 Zentari intelligence officer who turned out to be Kira. 1 Verdani medical support specialist. Together they would represent everything the Coalition stood for, which was cooperation between different species working toward common goals. "You have proven that humanity deserves its place in the Coalition," Vex continued. "More importantly, you have proven that strength comes in many forms and that the best warriors are not always the largest or most powerful, but rather those who understand how to turn any situation to their advantage." The audience erupted in applause, and Maya stood there feeling overwhelmed by the moment and by the responsibility that came with her new assignment. She had come to the Academy as a representative of a species that most aliens dismissed as weak and fragile, and she was leaving as the leader of an elite unit that would set the standard for future mixed-species operations. The weight of that transformation was almost too much to process, but she accepted it because she understood that this was what she had trained for her entire life. After the ceremony, Maya met with her new team members in a briefing room adjacent to the assembly hall, and they spent hours going over their orders and discussing how they would work together. Drak had changed significantly over the past months, and no longer carried the arrogance that had marked their first encounter, and instead showed genuine respect for her leadership and tactics. Kira was excited about the opportunity to put her diplomatic skills to use in field operations rather than from behind a desk. The Thorian, whose name was Kane, brought decades of combat experience and a pragmatic approach to problem-solving. The Verdani named Leaf demonstrated medical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile situations. They discussed their strengths and weaknesses as a team, and Maya emphasized that their diversity was their greatest asset because each member brought different perspectives and capabilities to any challenge they might face. She explained that human military doctrine emphasized adaptability and teamwork, and that their success would depend on trust and communication rather than on any individual's abilities. They practiced scenarios and ran simulations, and by the time they finished, Maya felt confident that Task Force Unity would live up to its name. The next morning, Maya prepared to depart the academy and board the transport that would take her team to their assigned vessel. She packed her few belongings, including the photo of her family and the worn book that had belonged to her grandfather, and she took one last look around the barracks that had been her home for 6 months. So much had changed since that first day when she had walked in carrying a single duffel bag and wondering if she belonged here. As she headed toward the docking bay, she passed groups of new cadets arriving for their own training, and she noticed that several of them were human. They looked nervous and uncertain just as she had been, but they also looked determined, and she could see in their eyes the same stubborn refusal to be underestimated that had driven her own success. One young cadet, who could not have been more than 20 years old, stopped her in the corridor and asked if she had any advice for someone just starting out. Maya paused and thought about everything she had learned over the past 6 months, and everything she wished someone had told her on that first day. She looked at the young cadet and saw herself reflected back, and she chose her words carefully because she knew they would be remembered. "The others will judge you based on your size and assume you are weak," Maya said. "Let them. Use their assumptions against them. Show them that humans do not win through strength alone, but through intelligence and technique and determination. Train harder than everyone else. Learn from every opponent. Never back down when you are right, but always be willing to learn when you are wrong. And remember that you are not just representing yourself, but every human who will come after you." The young cadet nodded and stood a little straighter, and Maya could see confidence replacing uncertainty in real time. She continued toward the docking bay where her team was waiting, and where their ship sat ready to take them to whatever challenges lay ahead. As she walked, she thought about how much had changed not just for her, but for humanity's place in the galaxy. The bullies who had tried to intimidate her on that first day had learned that size did not guarantee victory, and that lesson had spread throughout the coalition like ripples on water. Training protocols had been updated to include human combat techniques, and instructors were teaching principles of leverage and technique to cadets from dozens of species. Earth was receiving respect as a military power despite having the smallest average body size of any coalition member, and that respect opened doors for diplomacy and trade and cultural exchange. Maya boarded the transport with her team and found her seat in the passenger compartment and watched through the viewport as the academy grew smaller behind them. She was leaving as a different person than she had arrived, and she was taking with her friendships that crossed species boundaries and knowledge that would serve her well in the years to come. But most importantly, she was taking the certainty that she had changed something fundamental about how the galaxy viewed humanity. Task Force Unity would face dangerous missions and impossible odds and situations where their combined skills would be tested to the absolute limit. But Maya was ready because she had already proven the most important lesson, which was that determination and skill could overcome any disadvantage. The galaxy had learned that humans belonged among the stars, and now it was time to show them what humans could accomplish when given the chance to lead. The transport accelerated away from the station and jumped into faster-than-light travel, and Maya closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before focusing on the challenges ahead. She had started this journey as the new girl, who was grabbed by bullies, and she was ending it as a leader who would shape the future of coalition military operations. That transformation had required every ounce of skill and courage she possessed, but it had been worth it because now the path was clear for others to follow. The story of the human who fought back had become legend, and that legend would inspire